Welcome to the Right News Network.
Hello and welcome. I'm Emma with the headlines that matter most right now. A fragile ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran is cracking under pressure in the Strait of Hormuz, where the Trump administration launched an operation this week to guide stranded cargo ships through the contested waterway. Iranian forces attacked American naval vessels escorting merchant traffic on Monday, raising the stakes for one of the world's most critical shipping routes. Watch for further confrontations as both nations dig in on opposite sides of this dangerous standoff. Still on world affairs, the ceasefire between Washington and Tehran is already fraying, with Iran accused of breaking the agreement dozens of times. Our Middle East correspondent Layla Nazari has this. Layla?
Well, Emma, thanks. So the Pentagon Chair General Dan Kane said yesterday that Iran's attacked U.S. forces more than 10 times since that April 7th ceasefire went into effect. What's interesting is they've also fired at commercial shipping 9 times and seized 2 container ships. So it's not just military. They're going after merchant vessels, too.
Does Tehran acknowledge any of this?
Look, they haven't publicly admitted to it. Iranian officials are saying whatever they're doing in the region is defensive. They're claiming the U.S. military presence itself is the real provocation. It's the same argument they always make. But here's the thing. If these attacks keep happening without consequences, the ceasefire doesn't really mean anything, and we could be headed towards something much bigger.
Layla, appreciate it. Also on the world front, health authorities are racing to find a safe port for a cruise ship battling an outbreak of a rare and deadly virus. Nearly 150 passengers remain isolated off West Africa after 3 deaths and multiple confirmed cases. Our technology correspondent Alex Park has more on how the outbreak unfolded. Alex?
Well, Emma, this is a pretty unusual situation because hantavirus almost never spreads between people. It's typically transmitted through contact with infected rodents. But the WHO is now saying that 7 confirmed or suspected cases have appeared on the MV Hondius, and they believe some human-to-human transmission did occur between close contacts on the ship. 3 passengers have died, including an elderly Dutch couple and another unidentified passenger.
So what made this particular environment so conducive to spread?
Look, I think what's happening here is that cruise ships create conditions you just don't see on land. You've got hundreds of people in close quarters, shared ventilation systems, confined spaces. It's almost a perfect storm for a virus to jump between people if they're in really close contact. The British crew member, who's critically ill, and the UK passenger in critical condition suggest crew members may have been exposed while treating sick passengers without proper protective equipment.
Alex Park, appreciate the details on this developing situation. Moving to business now, tensions are simmering in the Strait of Hormuz, where the U.S. and Iran are walking a dangerous line. And our finance editor, Sophia Reeves, is here to break down what this means for your wallet. Sophia?
Well, Emma, the Pentagon's saying Iran hasn't actually broken the ceasefire, but these skirmishes are happening right in the middle of the world's most important oil shipping lane. We're talking about 1/3 of global seaborne oil moving through that strait every single day. So even the threat of escalation is starting to spook energy markets, and shipping companies are already rethinking their routes.
What's the actual impact we're seeing right now at the pump and in the markets?
Look, crude prices haven't spiked dramatically yet, but that's because traders are betting both sides will keep things below the boiling point. What's interesting is insurance costs for ships in that region are climbing fast, and companies are factoring in extra security expenses. If this actually escalates into real conflict, you're looking at oil prices potentially jumping 20-30% pretty quickly, which ripples through everything from gas prices to heating costs to airline tickets.
Sophia, appreciate the context there. Violence is erupting in one of the world's most strategically important regions. The Persian Gulf is seeing a dangerous escalation between Iran and the United States, with attacks on the UAE marking the first major breach of an April ceasefire. Layla rejoins me now with the latest. Layla, what exactly happened?
Well, Emma, so on Monday we saw attacks against the UAE for the first time since that ceasefire was announced back in April. And here's the thing, the US and Iran exchanged fire during this flare-up, which means it's not just a regional issue anymore. This is directly pulling in American forces. What's happening now is there's already talk about renewed strikes on Iranian targets, and honestly, that ceasefire that everyone thought might hold. It's looking pretty fragile right now.
Why would Iran risk breaking the ceasefire now?
Look, I think the calculus here is complicated. Iran's been under intense economic sanctions. There's constant U.S. military presence in the Gulf, and from Tehran's perspective, those are ongoing provocations. But the international community's interpretation is completely different. They're seeing this as Iran testing boundaries and essentially saying the agreement doesn't matter. That's why you're hearing these calls for strikes. The real risk is that both sides think they're responding defensively when actually they're pushing towards something much bigger.
Layla, appreciate the reporting. A mining disaster in central Colombia has claimed 9 lives, and this isn't the first tragedy at this particular site. Our World Affairs correspondent James Chen joins us with more on what's driving these repeated accidents. James?
Well, Emma, 9 coal miners are dead after a methane gas explosion at a mine in Sutatausa. What's striking here is this is the second major disaster at this exact location in less than 2 years. The region has dozens of small mining operations, a lot of them informal, and they're extracting both coal and emeralds. Safety oversight is pretty minimal.
Why are conditions so dangerous in these mines?
Look, a lot of these operators are small scale, and they'll say they can't afford the equipment needed to detect and manage gas buildup. But here's the thing. Safety advocates argue that's no excuse. You've got workers going down into these shafts without proper ventilation systems, without monitoring equipment. It's just inherently risky work, and when you repeat the same accident at the same location twice in 2 years, it suggests nothing's really changed.
James, appreciate it. A deadly attack in Germany today. 2 people killed after a car was driven into a crowd in the eastern city of Leipzig. A 33-year-old suspect is now in custody. Back to Alex.
Well, Emma, this happened Monday afternoon in what's a busy public area in Leipzig's city centre. 2 people were killed, several others injured, when a car was deliberately driven into the crowd. Authorities have detained a 33-year-old German citizen, though right now we don't have details on what motivated him or his background yet.
Is there any indication this was an ideologically motivated attack?
Look, that's still unclear at this point. Investigators are still working through that. What we do know is it wasn't accidental. The vehicle was deliberately aimed at the crowd. This is something European cities have dealt with before, unfortunately, and it's going to put pressure on officials to reassess security at public gathering spaces.
Alex, appreciate the latest there. Continuing on world affairs, a major industrial disaster in central China has raised questions about workplace safety standards in the manufacturing sector. At least 26 people died and 61 were injured in an explosion at a fireworks factory in Hunan province. Investigators are expected to determine whether safety protocols were followed as officials consider what regulatory changes might be needed. A critical security breach is exposing millions of Windows users who rely on the popular Daemon Tools application. Kaspersky says Chinese-linked hackers compromised the software with a backdoor during a month-long attack that resulted in thousands of infection attempts and at least a dozen successful hacks. If you use Daemon Tools, security experts are urging you to scan your machine immediately for signs of compromise. Romania's pro-European government has collapsed after Prime Minister Ilie Bolojan lost a no-confidence vote in parliament, with his own largest coalition partner joining far-right opposition parties to oust him. The move plunges the EU member state and NATO ally into political turmoil at a sensitive moment for European security. Watch for whether Romania can quickly form a new government or heads toward fresh elections that could strengthen far-right parties.
Time to go deeper. Beyond the headlines, our full analysis of the story shaping the world right now.
Three people are dead, a British crew member is fighting for their life, and a ship carrying 150 passengers, including 17 Americans, is stranded off the coast of West Africa because no port will let them in. The MV Hondius has a suspected hantavirus outbreak on board, and the WHO, the same WHO that fumbled the early weeks of COVID, is now telling us they think the virus may have spread between passengers, which is something hantavirus almost never does. This is a developing crisis with serious questions about institutional failure, international health architecture, and what happens when the systems we've built to protect us simply don't work fast enough. Joining me now are Marcus Webb, our defense and security analyst, and Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor. Marcus, let me start with you. Is this a one-off tragedy, or does this tell us something damning about the state of our international health response?
Thanks, Emma. Look, this is both, and that's what makes it so dangerous. 3 people are dead, and the immediate instinct from every major health institution is to manage the optics rather than name the failures. The WHO is monitoring the situation. Ports are refusing entry, and patients who need specialist medical care are floating off the West African coastline, while bureaucrats draft carefully worded statements. This is the same WHO that in January 2020 was still praising China's transparency while a novel coronavirus was spreading globally. Tucker Carlson made the point during COVID that an international body with no enforcement mechanism and every incentive to avoid offending member states is not a safety net. It's a liability dressed in respectable clothing. That diagnosis applies here with full force. And here's what I want to know. Where are the governments? 17 Americans on that ship, British nationals in critical condition. Where is the bilateral diplomatic pressure to secure port access? Where is the urgency? If Western governments are sitting back waiting for the WHO to sort this out, they've learned absolutely nothing from the last 6 years.
But Marcus, isn't that a bit unfair? Port refusals in a disease outbreak scenario aren't exactly unprecedented. Those governments have their own populations to protect. And Sophia, what's your take on this? Is this fundamentally a health failure, or is there an accountability gap here that goes deeper?
Well, look, Marcus is right that the institutional response is inadequate, but I think he's framing it too narrowly around the WHO. Here's what I think Marcus is missing. This is also a catastrophic market failure in the cruise industry itself. These companies operate globally. They profit enormously. They carry passengers from dozens of countries into biosecurity environments that vary wildly in their standards. And the question of what rodent exposure protocols exist on a vessel operating in regions where hantavirus is endemic, that question apparently wasn't being asked rigorously enough. Hantavirus fatality rates run anywhere from 1% to over 40% depending on the variant. The 1993 Sin Nombre outbreak in the American Southwest killed more than half the people it infected. This is not an obscure risk, and when industry self-regulation produces the minimum viable biosecurity standard, which is what happens in the absence of meaningful liability and enforcement, you get 3 dead passengers on a ship that can't find a port. The families of those Dutch passengers deserve to know why the protocols that should have caught this didn't.
I hear what Sophia is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely when it comes to the immediate crisis. Yes, we need better industry standards. Yes, there are long-term market accountability questions. But right now, today, there are people dying on a ship. Short, punchy reality check. No port will let them in. The WHO suspects human-to-human transmission. Patients are being prepared for evacuation, which means they haven't been evacuated yet. This is sovereign governments failing their own citizens in real time. Ben Shapiro has said it plainly. When institutions fail, nations must act unilaterally in defense of their own people. The United States government and the British government should be on the phone with every relevant government in that region, making it diplomatically and economically clear that their citizens will have port access and medical care. That's not a market question. That's a failure of national will.
Here's what I want to know, and this is the question that really keeps me up at night. If the WHO confirms human-to-human transmission of a virus that almost never spreads that way, what does that mean for how we handle the next 6 months of this? Sophia, where do you see this playing out?
The way I see this playing out, there are really two tracks running simultaneously, and they're pulling in opposite directions. On the science track, if human-to-human transmission is confirmed, the cruise industry faces a confidence crisis it genuinely cannot afford. COVID nearly broke that sector. Another major biosecurity failure associated with confined vessels and vulnerable passengers. The trajectory suggests catastrophic damage to bookings, to insurance frameworks, to the whole model. On the accountability track, though, and this is where I get genuinely pessimistic, history tells us that if this resolves with 3 deaths and a few recoveries and no formal attribution of institutional failure, nothing changes. The WHO walks away with its dysfunction intact. The cruise industry files this under rare incident, and we're having this same conversation in 5 years about a different ship and a different pathogen.
Here's what concerns me most. It's the port refusal precedent. If countries can simply decline to accept vessels carrying sick Western nationals without any diplomatic consequence, that becomes normalized. And the risk here is that we're building a world where international health emergencies become prolonged standoffs. Sick passengers floating in international waters while governments calculate their own domestic political risk from accepting a ship associated with a deadly virus. The trajectory, if current trends continue, is that Western nations lose the ability to guarantee even basic medical access to their own citizens abroad. That is a sovereignty failure of the first order. And if Washington and London aren't treating this as the serious diplomatic emergency it is, somebody needs to be held to account for that negligence.
Marcus Webb, Sophia Reeves, powerful analysis from both of you tonight. One thing is certain. Somewhere in Geneva, there's a WHO official drafting a very careful press release, and 3 families are burying their loved ones who deserved better than careful language. The Strait of Hormuz is on a knife's edge tonight. American naval forces are actively escorting commercial vessels through one of the world's most critical shipping lanes under an operation called Project Freedom. But Iran's IRGC has responded with warnings, confrontations, and what the Pentagon is awkwardly describing as attacks that somehow don't threaten the ceasefire. National Review is blunt. They're calling it the ceasefire coming apart, and the initial skirmishes, they say, may have already begun. The world's energy markets and potentially a great deal more hang in the balance. Joining me now are Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor, and James Chen, our geopolitical analyst. Sophia, let me start with you. Is Pete Hegseth's insistence that the ceasefire certainly holds credible, or is Washington already in denial about what's unfolding?
Thanks, Emma. Look, certainly holds is one of the most extraordinary pieces of doublespeak we've heard out of the Pentagon in years, and that is saying something. Iranian forces attacked American naval assets during Project Freedom on Monday. The IRGC is actively warning vessels away from routes that U.S. forces are escorting them through. At what point does the definition of ceasefire become so elastic it ceases to mean anything? Here's what's really going on. Tehran is running a classic probing operation. They're testing whether Washington's commitment to Project Freedom is real or rhetorical, and Hegseth handed them the answer on a plate by immediately calling it temporary. Douglas Murray has written about this pattern extensively. The West announces a firm posture, then immediately qualifies it into irrelevance, and our adversaries take notes. The IRGC didn't become one of the most strategically patient military organizations in the world by accident. They know a timed concession when they see one. And right now they're looking at a clock that Washington set for them.
But Sophia, the counter-argument is that Hegseth is managing an incredibly volatile situation, and that publicly committing to an open-ended naval operation could actually escalate tensions rather than calm them. Isn't there a case that this measured language is deliberate strategic ambiguity rather than weakness? And James, What's your take on this?
Well, look, I hear what Sophia's saying, and she's right about the messaging problem, but I think she's actually underselling the economic dimension here, which changes the strategic calculus completely. 21 million barrels of oil per day flow through that strait. That's 21% of global petroleum consumption. Lloyd's war risk premiums are spiking. And here's what Sophia's framework misses. The immediate pressure on the Trump administration isn't just military, it's market pressure. Energy prices moving sharply upward is a political problem for Trump domestically. So when Hegseth says temporary, part of what he's doing is managing the oil market's anxiety, trying to signal that this doesn't become a permanent standoff that reprices global energy for months. That's not nothing. But, and here's my concern, the economic logic actually demands more firmness, not less, because the market uncertainty generated by Iranian disruption of the Strait is itself an economic weapon. And the only way to neutralize it is to make clear that the waterway will remain open, regardless of what Tehran does.
I hear what James is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely on the strategic level. You don't manage Iranian aggression through market signaling. You manage it through military credibility. The 1987 tanker war, Operation Earnest Will, Operation Praying Mantis. America destroyed Iranian oil platforms and sank Iranian vessels, and Tehran backed down. That's the historical template. Every time Washington has tried to finesse Iranian pressure with clever language and temporary commitments, Iran has advanced. Every time America has responded with actual force, Iran has retreated. It is not complicated. It is just uncomfortable. And calling Project Freedom temporary doesn't calm the oil market. It tells the oil market that Iranian disruption of the Strait has a future, which is the single worst message you can possibly send to energy traders right now.
Here's what I want to know, because this feels like it's building towards something, and I want both of you to be honest about it. Given that we have Iranian attacks on UAE territory, attacks on American forces, IRGC warnings to commercial shipping, and a defense secretary describing the ceasefire as holding, despite all of that, where does this actually go in the next 6 months, James? Where do you see this playing out?
The way I see this playing out, there are really two live scenarios. The first is that Iran runs down the clock on temporary. They keep the pressure at just below the threshold that forces a decisive American response, wait for Project Freedom to end, and then reassert control over Strait access as leverage in any future nuclear or sanctions negotiations. If current trends continue, that's actually the most likely near-term outcome, because it requires Iran to do nothing except be patient, which they're extraordinarily good at. The second, and this is the scenario that keeps analysts up at night, is a miscalculation. One IRGC vessel commander makes a decision his superiors didn't authorize. One American naval officer responds the way his rules of engagement permit. And suddenly you have an incident that neither Washington nor Tehran can politically afford to walk away from. History tells us that's how regional wars actually start, not with decisions, but with incidents.
Here's what concerns me most, and this goes beyond the immediate military picture. If America allows Iran to effectively veto commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, even temporarily, every authoritarian regime on the planet recalibrates. China watches what happens in the Strait of Hormuz before deciding how it handles the South China Sea. Iran's proxies across the Middle East watch what happens here before deciding how aggressively to push in their own theaters. The risk isn't just another tanker war. The risk is that a managed American retreat from the Strait becomes the proof of concept for a generation of revisionist powers who've been wondering whether Western resolve is real or performative. Trump has the mandate and the military assets to settle this decisively. The question is whether the people around him, and I'm looking directly at the temporary language coming out of Hegseth's office, have the strategic nerve to let him.
Sophia Reeves, James Chen, a sobering and genuinely important conversation. One thing is certain tonight. Somewhere in Tehran, someone in the IRGC is reading Pete Hegseth's press conference transcript very, very carefully.
That wraps up today's top stories. I'm Emma. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.